Is it me, or is it starting to look like the Albanese government is getting a little bit, well, out over its skis on this whole voice to Parliament thing? Last night, we talked about how Peter Dutton had put a letter framing a number of questions to the government over the voice, and how that was a smart idea, because it was a clever bit of politics that meant Dutton avoided falling into the trap the Prime Minister was clearly hoping he would fall into. Namely, to take a hard position against the voice, face a party room fracture from pro-voice Liberal senators and MPs, and allow the media to continue their post-election narrative that the party of the centre-right is just a bunch of hopeless dinosaurs headed for extinction. Where previously the Albanese government had managed to frame the issue and much of the conversation around what can only be called the vibe of the thing, Liberal and other voters who have questions now have the cover to do so and to ask those questions without being attacked necessarily as bad people, which is exactly how Anthony Albanese wanted it to be. And guess now who is asking some of those questions, who those questions are now being asked by? Well, yes, the ABC. Soon after this program ended last night, Alba went on the 7:30 report. Now, of course, you missed it because you were right here watching the great man Gary Hardgrave. But you know what? I checked it out later on, so you didn't have to. And I'll tell you what, the whole thing was pretty telling. Just have a look at this.
The second thing that is in the draft wording of the proposals I've put forward at the Gama Festival that you attended, of course, is that the voice will be subservient to the Parliament. That is, Parliament will continue to control the destiny.
So just on that, Prime Minister, sorry to interrupt, but is it still your intent to put to the Australian people the principle of a voice to Parliament and leave that detail for Parliament to work out in the event of a yes vote?
Well, the way that our Constitution works, David, is that you have the principles of the way that our Constitution, our nation's birth certificate operate.
Okay, Prime Minister, so just so we're clear, the detail is to be worked out later by the Parliament after the yes vote, right? Well, okay. And yet just a few minutes after that, saying that, the Prime Minister said this when asked about reports on how the voice might operate.
When will you or the rest of us see those reports, and what do you expect them to include?
Well, they're doing the work through about how the voice could operate, but doing it in being informed by the work that's already been done. See,
Will those reports be made public once they're done?
Of course, just like people can log on now and look at the report of Tom Calma and Marcia Langton. They can look at the interim report that the committee co-chaired by Julian Leeser, who's now responsible for Indigenous Affairs.
But you have not committed to those reports
in the coalition.
So, indeed, what we keep hearing is that all the detail we could ever want is in the Calma and Langton report, only that's not necessarily going to be the model the government follows. Now, this was a bit much even for Spearsy.
To be clear, though, they're not proposals that you have accepted.
Because what we are doing here, David, is trying to get and reach out and get as much support as possible.
Okay, so the model hasn't been decided, but we have one, but we aren't using it. Oh, you know what? I give up. And guess what? I suspect all of this is going to make a lot of other voters, including a lot who are on the fence, give up too. Because the government is now looking, frankly, quite tricky on this. Where once the government had the vibe and momentum behind it, it is now getting tripped up by its refusal to let us in on how that vibe will actually operate in practice. Even worse is the attempt to silence those pushing the no case on the voice by creating a self-reinforcing doom loop of virtue signaling. We saw this recently when Facebook was caught out censoring ads from Advance Australia that said the voice would give certain Australians special rights on the basis of their race, simply because an expert panel that took a very narrow reading of the words rights disagreed and had their position picked up by a fact-check unit at RMIT, well, guess what happened? Facebook was then able to weed out disinformation as an excuse to block the ads. And the situation has been made all the worse by the refusal of the government to fund both the yes and no case, like happened in the 1999 Republic referendum, because they are instead, guess what? Cynically relying on big corporations and others looking to tick boxes on their reconciliation action plans to carry the can for them. The government will in coming weeks be hoping to regain the momentum on this, but it is clear that they are rattled and now retreating to complaining that those skeptical of their plans and of the voice are nothing but, culture warriors. In the meantime, we are told that we can expect a week of door knocking and community barbecues to spread the word by voice proponents. Those handing out flyers and manning the tongs should be prepared with answers and not just vibe. Meanwhile, let's go over to the United States, where there have been a couple of extraordinary news stories which show just how things work, depending on who the subject of the story in the media is. Now, you probably know that I'm on record as believing that it is time for Donald Trump to step back and let someone like Ron DeSantis or Glenn Youngkin from Virginia take the lead in the Republican Party. But it is very, very helpful indeed for everyone on the right in the U.S. and indeed Australia too, because the same lessons apply and the same rules work here, to note the media's behavior. A little item today in the Washington Post. Guess what? Remember when we were all told that Russian trolls swung the 2016 election, and that's why Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton? Not because, she was an awful candidate who spent all her time campaigning in the Hamptons. Well, not so much. According to a study reported in the paper, quote, Russian influence operations on Twitter in the 2016 presidential election reached relatively few users, most of whom were highly partisan Republicans, and the Russian accounts had no measurable impact in changing minds or influencing voter behavior. Well. Recall, of course, that 5 years ago, the same Washington Post was running articles like this one, which claimed that, quote, the wide distribution of strategically aligned messages increases the likelihood that Russian efforts, including posts, ads, tweets, and the release of stolen emails, changed the outcome of the 2016 election, unquote. So can we call everyone who called Trump an illegitimate tool of the Russians election deniers now? Meanwhile, you'll also recall that a few months ago, the media was up in arms because an FBI raid uncovered classified documents at Trump's Mar-a-Lago compound. Well, the shoe is on the other foot now, as classified documents have been found lying around Joe Biden's vice presidential think tank in Washington. Now, it's worth recalling what Joe Biden said when those documents were found in Trump's possession.
When you saw the photograph of the top secret documents laid out on the floor at Mar-a-Lago, what did you think to yourself, looking at that image?
How that could possibly happen, how anyone could be that irresponsible. And I thought, what data was in there that may compromise sources and methods?
Now, though, the Wall Street Journal reports that Biden is a bit more quiet on the subject. Reported the paper, quote, Mr. Biden didn't respond to questions about the documents shouted at him Monday as he was with Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador at the National Palace in Mexico City. You know what they say, it's good to be the king, I guess, so long as you're on the left.